Do you agree that with the reality that Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders are hugely talented, the tops in NRL, AFL, arts, business, science, sports, politics, with a higher proportion of Aboriginals in federal parliament than across Australia?
I do.
Thank you. I thought you would. I was hoping you would. Now, I've driven to all Cape York communities twice and some 3 times. I've flown or boated into Torres Strait Island communities. Minister, do you agree that people in communities care for each other?
I do, and if I just might request to the Chair the relevance of this to the budget questioning.
I'm just getting onto that now. Thank you, Minister. An overwhelming majority of Australians in every jurisdiction, except this Australian Capital Territory ivory tower, disconnected as it is from Australians, voted in the Voice referendum that Aboriginals and Islanders already have plenty of voices. In addition to the voices of the fine Aboriginal senators in this room, and I note that all of them are women.
Senator Roberts, I'm struggling to identify the relevance of this question to estimates.
Well, Aboriginals and Islanders have many other voices. Minister, these include registered Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander corporations, 3,521, including 243 native title bodies, 12,966 charities and not-for-profit commissions providing aid to Aboriginals, land councils 48, not including state land councils, regional councils 35, Aboriginal
Senator Roberts, you need to come to a question because you've gone through so much information and opinion, it will be impossible to discern what the question is. So refrain from making a lengthy statement or with excessive commentary and try and put your question. Thank you, Senator Roberts.
Minister, can you consider the possibility that this morass of bodies, often with overlapping and disjointed responsibilities, is part of the core problem, not the solution?
No, I don't, Senator Roberts.
I hope you agree that patronising paternalism and top-down approaches fail to get buy-in of people on the ground, Minister. Isn't that why such approaches fail, top-down?
Well, I will say that your questioning is quite patronising and top-down, Senator Roberts.
Okay. Failing to get buy-in, top-down approaches fail to get accountability. Is that correct?
I've answered your question. This is very patronising, your questions. There is no question here that's related to the budget, Chair.
The Closing the Gap annual report is very clear. A total failure in closing the gap with only 4 of 17 targets being met or goals achieved, and some actually worsening. I'm sure you'd acknowledge that symbolic gestures and overreach promises have not achieved better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
Well, I reject the assertion that symbolism is not important, Senator Roberts. I come from a very strong people of the Anua people. We are enormously proud not only of our language, we are enormously proud of our history and our current status as artists, as dancers, as singers. In fact, we have the Malindu Festival coming up. We celebrate culture and symbolism every day, every year, so I reject your question.
Well, perhaps I didn't explain my question clearly enough, but anyway.
Senator Roberts, I couldn't discern a question aside from the commentary in it, so please come to your question.
My question was about acknowledging that symbolic gestures are not closing the gap. When I travel across communities in far north Queensland and in the Northern Territory, listening to local Aboriginal people, I found that they know the solution. I was told that there are many fine people who relied on keeping the gap wide, relied on keeping the gap wide because those people were working the system and their livelihood depended on the ongoing failure of closing the gap programs. I recall a Bardu Island councillor, I might have told you this before, Minister. He told us that closing the gap campaign ensures the money continuing into the pockets of consultants, activists, lawyers, bureaucrats, contractors, politicians, academics, advocates, rorting the system of Aboriginal welfare grants and programs to entrench the gap. And this hurts the people in the communities. That's my real concern here, the people in the communities. The Aboriginal industry, depends on the gap being maintained, not closed. Minister, are you aware of this?
Senator Roberts, I will say this to you. The whole point behind closing the gap is so that the Australian Parliament and the Australian community can be aware of the discrepancies between the life expectancy of First Nations people to non-Indigenous Australians, of the unemployment gap, of the educational gap, of the employment gap. That is the whole point of closing the gap. And there are many levels and many layers of that. And the important one that you are a part of is the institution that you are sitting in right now, and that is to hold to account whether the closing the gap is working or not, and whether the gaps can be filled in different ways. Your representation of Queensland as a senator is part of that. So your questions to the Senate estimate to the relevant departments is absolutely critical. But I reject outright that closing the gap in itself, in terms of our work with the peak organisations, is irrelevant. It is very relevant. It is an imperfect structure, but is one that is trying to do its best in terms of trying to improve the lives of First Nations people in our country in a collective way, in a transparent way, and one that is held highly by this institution called the Australian Parliament.
Minister, my constituents I treat regardless of their background. I treat the same, and I listen to them. And many people of Aboriginal descent are telling me that the system is failing. The closing the gap system or morass of agencies is actually hindering the closing of the gap.
Senator, you're here at Senate estimates to ask those very agencies those very questions. Now, you may have an opinion.
No, it's not my opinion. I'm telling you my constituents'
Well, you may have a view as a result of your constituents, but your particular question can go directly to an agency as to what is happening. So what is the question that constituent is asking you to ask?
Minister, this government has continually refused to authorise an audit of government spending in this sector. Looking at the morass of agencies, they're doing more damage than
So those are the words of your constituent.
Why?
The morass.
Why is there
the dangers?
Why? What is being hidden? Why won't you conduct an audit of these agencies to help the people in the communities?
We have the Australian National Audit Office, Senator. We already have in place in this institution high levels of audits that are constantly taking place. This Senate estimates process, whether you understand it or not, Senators, is another form, and a very important form, of transparency and accountability. You have every single agency before you. Ministers try not to speak to enable you the opportunity to directly ask the questions of the agencies. I mean, you have that power to represent your constituency. And Senator Roberts, in these couple of minutes that you're asking these questions, you are failing to do that.
Well, that may be your opinion, Minister. So let me tell you that in my questioning of the Australian National Audit Office, they don't do specific audits. They do overall audits of processes.
Senator
That's it.
Come to your question.
Well, I'm just answering the Minister. Will this government accept the recommendations of the Productivity Commission to move away from bureaucracy at a high level? In other words, from making uninformed decisions from an ivory tower, actually do an audit?
Well, it depends on the report that you're referring to with the Productivity Commission, Senator Roberts. The Productivity Commission is there to give advice in terms of how processes occur. The most recent Productivity Commission that I recall was certainly on First Nations, on the First Nations area, and the collaboration and the voices that need to be heard by First Nations people. The Australian people rejected that at the referendum. So clearly we have to ensure that the status quo, which currently exists, has to be better.
Thank you. Last question, Senator Roberts.
When will this group accept the advice from grassroots Indigenous groups such as WA's Empowered Communities and its chair, Mr Ian Truss, as to what works and what does not work based on real-life experience and successes, and get away from the top-down, patronising, paternalistic approach of so many agencies, the black and white Aboriginal industry, and actually
Roberts,
get down to what people are needing?
You're putting lengthy statements in and commentary into
When will
your
you start addressing
Chair.
people's needs in the communities?
Senator Roberts, you actually said so much in your preamble there. What I will say to you is this. You have a responsibility to ask directly to the agencies here on particular questions.
And the government.
And the government, absolutely. However, I may say this. You used an example of an individual from far Western Australia, but you didn't exactly state the purpose behind what they've raised. And I would encourage you, Senator, if you really do care to improve the lives of First Nations people, you would do so diligently, and you would do so with all the agencies who are relevant to that question.
Thank you, Senator
I have
Roberts.
faith in Aboriginals.
I'll now give the call.
Why don't the government have